Hello there, and welcome to The Value of Everything. I'm pleased to welcome my guest, Nicholas Gruen. He is the CEO of Lateral Economics and the chairman of the Open Knowledge Foundation in Australia. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Charles.
Hey, so just to begin with, can you give us a little brief outline of what you do and what you're working on right now?
I do a lot of different things. I've just finished a 6-year stint as chairman of a great organisation called the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. I did finish that up last year, so I'm not doing so much of that anymore. I run Lateral Economics, which is an economic policy consultancy. It's described as Lateral Economics Advisedly. It's amazing how often one can find a new way of applying very simple economic principles to a problem.
Yep.
And that's essentially what lateral economics does. I'm broadening my horizons somewhat. I'm finding myself more and more drawn into questions of political philosophy, I guess, rather like Friedrich Hayek, who is a bit of an influence on me.
Yep.
I find, so I'm more and more persuaded that we are coming to the end of the road with electoral democracy, and we've got to decide whether we're going to just watch the toxicity levels rise, as we have seen so spectacularly in the United States, or whether we are going to try and embrace democracy. And the only way to do that I can think of is to understand that there are two ways to represent the people. In other words, two ways to scale democracy. You can represent people by way of election, and that's the system we have now. And I'm not suggesting we get rid of that, but I think we could tame it a great deal by introducing a lot more democracy by lot, which is the Athenian method, which we still use in juries, which is to appoint people from the community in ways which, largely at random, but it might be at random from selected groups. And we might have time over our discussion for me to explore some of the attractions of doing it that way.
Yeah, definitely. Just so we don't loop around as a few times, I'll make a little note for that just to return into that. Now, this is a question I usually ask for a lot of my guests, and it's always an interesting one. Do you have an ideology, and if so, what is it?
Good question. I guess in many ways I style myself as a centrist. I guess I wrote one of my earliest blog posts was a blog post which I can, if you have a website or whatever, I can send you a link to it, which described myself as a conservative, liberal, social democrat. And what I meant by that was that those three traditions, conservatism, liberalism, and social democracy, have very great things to say to us, every one of them. And of course, every one of them purports to be a kind of coherent position that you can take up and then take up in contradistinction to the others. In my opinion, when you approach a problem, you just take those principles as seriously as you can, and perhaps like a judge in a court case, when there are different precedents and different considerations, you decide what you think are the most important principles in the circumstances.
Right.
But that's still a little bit evasive, and I think it's probably appropriate for people to somehow say something about left or right. And I am reminded of what Carl Menger, who was a one of the great marginalists in the late 19th century, along with Jevons and Walras. He was the Austrian who pushed us towards marginalism, marginal analysis. And he said that he had read the entire works of Adam Smith, and on not one occasion had Smith taken the side of the powerful against the weak or the rich against the poor. And in fact, Smith was a favourite of the French revolutionaries.
Yep.
And all I can say in that regard is I don't think people think I'm terribly left-wing, and I don't think I'm terribly left-wing, but in sentiment, the wealthy and the powerful don't need any help from me, and wouldn't particularly want any. Whereas, so that's how I try and look at the world, but that doesn't always mean taking the immediate side of the poor and the weak. You might say, well, if the poor and the weak are the architects of their own poverty and their own weakness, then simply sort of trying to say how good they are is actually a counterproductive strategy. But that gives you a bit of a flavour of my sentiments, perhaps.
Yeah, I recently watched one of your videos in relation to the Bitcoin and the blockchain.
Yep.
Yeah, I noticed with you, you've got a very open mind. You're willing to entertain a lot of arguments. You're not necessarily going to just go, boom, you're wrong. You're just going, okay, give me more information.
Indeed. Pathologically open-minded, I would describe myself as. I'm always thinking, whenever I get confident about something, I'm already thinking, okay, there's got to be something about this that's probably wrong. And if someone disagrees with you, then the really interesting thing is, do they have something to tell you, or are they full of themselves? And you have to you can't figure that out without showing a bit of humility and imagining that they might have something to say. And very often you're disappointed. They're just blowhards, but you have to imagine that. I learnt that in history. That was the only education I ever really got, that it's not a competition. It's not a cleverness competition. It's a listening competition. It's trying to understand, trying to listen to different signals and then judge their relative merits and their relative strength.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that the Gruen family has some very prominent economists. How has that shaped you?
Well, I like to say that both my brother and I tried very hard not to be economists, and we both failed. Our father was quite a prominent architect of early neoliberal reform in Australia, and my brother went off and did physics and physiology, and I went off and did history and law. This is a matter of some interest to me because my pathway to economics was an unusual one. I worked for Senator John Button in the mid-80s, and he was part of a very successful Labor government in the 80s, the Hawke-Keating government.
Yeah. And
I had the job of trying to brief him on our car industry, which was shockingly protectionist. Terrible policy had taken an industry which was quite competitive and almost ruined it. And what shocked me was that the economists that I spoke to, for them, economics was a kind of a badge of identity. It wasn't an engine of inquiry. And it was and I understood economics very well because I'd talked with my dad about it. I kind of got the hang of it, even if I hadn't studied it at university.
Yeah.
And I discovered, to my great surprise, that these guys didn't have any intuition. And I could very quickly, and it's probably not the right part of this interview to say precisely what the issue was, but I could very quickly work out in their language what they weren't allowing to be said. And so you couldn't go anywhere in an argument. You would just, you were more or less corralled into this position that you either supported what they took to be the right answer, which was partly the right answer, but also in an important way the wrong answer. You were either to more or less, you were either to sign up to that or to be branded a protectionist. And that was completely ridiculous, very disappointing, and really genuinely was the beginning of my forging the way I think about economics.
A lot of people, they say, oh, well, these academics, they lack in the life skills. Would you say that was one of the things that you experienced with these people?
Yes, they did. They didn't lack in the bureaucratic skills. They were doing quite well in that regard. But it's not. It's not. Yes, it's the skill of listening. I think economists. I don't know a discipline that's worse at listening than economics. The whole discipline is a monument to the inability of economists to listen to and look and observe what is around it, because you have this elaborate formal structure, and it's I don't know whether it needs to be quite so elaborate or formal, but that's really sort of not so different to Adam Smith. And then you have to try and use those tools and those ideas to think about concrete problems, and go look at an economics journal and see how well they do that. There are whole sub-disciplines of economics that are built around essentially absurd propositions. Real business cycle theory is an example of that. The idea that economies are instantly equilibrating, that ultimately the Great Depression represents a spontaneous holiday taken by 30 million workers around the Western world. It's extraordinary. It's completely extraordinary. But if you're clever enough, you can do all the equations, no one minds. This is much better for you than to try to carefully think about the phenomena that you're investigating, the way in which the hints that you get from your discipline help you structure a line of inquiry and start working towards possible solutions, and build critiques of other people's position and your own position, and get to a place where you think you've done the best you can with the tools you have. That isn't a description of the way economics works.
Yeah. Just going back to your family for a second here, you
Yep.
know, obviously, a lot of people say, well, you get modelled in like your family's, they sculpt you to the way that you are, but I feel there's a lot more lessons to be learned from mistakes which were made in the past. Do you feel like there's anything that you've picked up from your father or anything like that, which you've taken into your knowledge or your philosophy?
I'm not sure. I think quite a lot about my father. My father's mother was engulfed in the Holocaust. He had a very interesting life, which just struck me as nothing more than just interesting until, very, embarrassingly late in my life. When you're a kid and you learn these stories about your parents, you don't distinguish real adventure and suffering from, a playground activity. And so it's taken me a long time to sort of think my way into my father's mind, and I can't imagine I'm very far into doing that. I think that's sort of largely impossible, but somehow come to grips with him as another person rather than this abstract figure that is my father. Now, one of the things I remember him saying to me, it was actually when he was dying, which was that I remember when I was about 6 or 7 years old, we went to Alice Springs, in the centre of Australia, for 3 weeks, and I was a kid, and Mum and my brother and I went. We had 3 weeks of activities. We went on a tour to Ayers Rock, and we travelled around the place, and Dad was working away. And the upshot of this, and he told me this, I don't know, 30 years later, 40 years later, was that Dad was doing a survey with a sociologist and a political scientist about the equal wage case. So in 1965, I think it was, there was a huge, a big case held in the Australian courts about whether Aboriginal stockmen should be given equal wages.
Yep.
And my father was the only one of these three social scientists. Probably they were all somewhat left of centre. My father was pretty mildly left of centre, and at least one of the other two not so much. anyway, my father said that, so they all said, yes, of course, Aboriginal people should get equal wages with white people.
Mhm.
But my father said, but that would lead to a fall in labour demand for Aboriginal people, that pushing their wages up would lead to unemployment amongst Aboriginal people, and that was something that policy should take on board.
The hidden hand.
And Dad was accused of being a racist. Dad was accused of thinking that Aboriginal people were worse than white people. Or, you know, you can fill in all the gaps. It's sort of even worse today than it was then with that kind of nonsense. And he never went anywhere near Aboriginal economics ever again. And he just said it's much too hard, much too hard.
Yeah.
It's, you know, you get attacked. You don't know, you don't really know what you're talking about. It's such a hard subject. You don't understand this other culture at all well, which has always been the problem in Australia, that these two cultures are like, you know, from different planets. And then everybody throws brickbats at you, and all the people who are throwing brickbats at you are tremendously self-satisfied and think that because they say these words, it proves what good people they are. Well, pig's arse it does. It proves something else, in my opinion.
Yeah. When everyone thinks about like economists, they think, oh, okay, like working with the RBA and trying to get the ASX floating and these big multinationals and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But really, to get in economics right, it's really your focus point is how do you solve the problems of poverty in the world? These kind of issues. How do you get like a society that's really distributing very well? It's not all, there's not like stoppers or there's problems in the pipework there.
Yeah,
it's a very interesting subject, and
it's a very interesting subject, and it's a subject that economics has been very bad at. I mean, I'm sure there are aspects of economics that are indispensable and important. Obviously, studying income flows, income distribution, economists have quite a bit to say about that. What they're rather bad at typically is understanding poverty, is understanding that poverty comes with a kind of colossal blow to morale, and the economists who do appreciate that, I suppose they're more on the left. Still, you know, the thing for me is that there's no point in me sympathizing with people. The question is, might I be able to have some insights into how things might be made better for them? And in that regard, my time at the Australian Centre for Social Innovation was a tremendous revelation, because what we did there is we actually lived something which most people don't really even know exists, because they hear it so often in a slogan that they think that they know what it is. So, you know, that slogan, putting people at the centre of everything we do, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what we did. And to give you an example, we were asked to build an early intervention program to try to reduce the number of families falling into crisis. Well, how the hell would you do that? Yeah. So I turn up, I've been called I get made the chairman of this organisation when it's just starting this process. Why am I made the chairman? Because everybody wants the respectability of an economist. That makes everybody think that you're hard-headed, because apparently economists are supposed to spend all their time looking at spreadsheets and numbers and so on.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I observed this process, and the process begins with these families in the outer suburbs. We went out, not me personally, but the team that built this program spent their time inviting them. They recruited families in local shopping centres. They said, we'd like to come and have dinner with you. We'll bring the pizza. They spent several months doing this, and they slowly built and co-designed with the families an intervention, and I'll describe the intervention to you. You can imagine a standard intervention. The standard intervention would be, these families, there's a problem with them, so what do? We'll get social workers, we'll get a whole bunch of social workers. The social workers will design a program, and then they'll deliver the program, and before you know it, social workers from a completely different class out there visiting people in the outer suburbs. They come from the inner suburbs. They're all university graduates. They turn up with their clipboards, How do you think that's going to go? I mean, no, they won't get kicked out. There'll be mutual incomprehension and nothing will happen, and a lot of money will be spent on social workers. What we did, so we'd sort of tested ideas out, and then the next week we'd come back and we'd trial the ideas, we'd prototype the ideas. We ended up with a program in which families we had recruited who had been through tough times were put on a board, a bit like a dating site, and families who identified themselves as going through tough times would read their profiles and say, I think I'd like to be mentored by that family. And then, and this is really important, it's not the old sort of Rousseau story that civilization's the problem, we'll all make this up as we go along. Then the very important thing, which is professional knowledge is delivered to this program, as I like to say, as midwife, not as obstetrician. And I think you know what I mean by that. So a coach, a trained coach, didn't have to be a qualified social worker, but a trained coach then takes all of the knowledge and growing knowledge that we built into and then comes out of the program and takes people through this structured, professionally designed, co-designed with the families program, and it's very powerful. So that then starts getting me interested in these questions of poverty and so on, because it seems to me that we don't have to be tragic liberals as I was before this, which is, the poor will always be with us and we may as well, hand them some arms. Be nice to them, but know that there's nothing much you can do. We can do quite a lot. Now, the poor I expect the poor will always still be with us. There will still be people who are not able to look after themselves, who are self-destructive and destructive of others and all the rest of it. But from what I've seen, using simple ideas like the ones I've explained to you, we can have a much bigger impact on these difficult problems than you might expect. And I'd like to see everyone excited about that. But alas, they're not. And economists are not particularly interested in this stuff.
Yeah. One thing I always find interesting about how economics actually affects people, and like a lot of governments spend a lot of money on education. Education molds the mind and everything. But how much does the economic structure of a society affects a character in like the day-to-day dealings?
It's a very interesting question. I obviously any answer is pretty speculative. One of the things I'm rather fond of Adam Smith's idea that commercial society, what he called commercial society, we would now call capitalism, he was a bit concerned about it in some respects. He thought that it dulled the martial spirit. He was a bit afraid that after a few centuries of such prosperity, possibly a country couldn't fight for itself. There doesn't seem to be too much evidence of that. But one of the things that he thought was that commercial society was otherwise very good for people because it has a conviviality about it. That is, one is typically advantaged by one's connections with people. At any point, a connection with someone could become a mutually beneficial connection. There is some evidence that that's the case. So there was a famous 15-society cross-society study or cross-country study of things like measured selfishness in various, dictator games and public good games and those kinds of things. If you want, I can explain those if you like. But the point is that using these simple games, it was possible to show that where societies with quite low, subsistence, tribe-like societies grew in selflessness, grew in capacity to cooperate, the more they were exposed to markets, which in some senses is counterintuitive because everyone thinks of markets as a sort of an environment in which the idea of competition of all against all is somehow implicit. But Smith had a different view, and it looks like his instinct is, broadly speaking, right.
Yeah. Well, I guess let's just say, for example, When everyone's having a good time, then there's when the economy's going good, that everyone seems to be hedonistic and in it for themselves kind of thing. But when the system is, there's a little bit more of rationing which goes on. You think about like the World War, like two eras and stuff. There was
Yep.
a lot more community because everyone had to sort of count the beans and make things work in that respect.
Well,
So,
and they had a common enemy. They had a common enemy,
yes,
and that's
yeah,
tremendously good for morale. And unfortunately, we don't seem to psychologically be able to do that with global warming or any of these things. You hear lots of fairly pathetic sounding political rhetoric along those lines, but we just can't seem to do it. The other thing is that the state of an economy, if an economy is in recession, people seem to be much more fearful. So, I would say that, look at what austerity has done to politics in places like Great Britain and the United States.
yeah.
Not a pretty sight. So there's lots of things to think about there.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to move you on to another question about Austrian economics. Now, they would always say that when you use central planning, you're putting in these props of incentives and taxes. And what we don't really quite know is that when you incentivize something, you're redistributing wealth from one place to another. And potentially there could have been a growth in a different market. There's all these redirections which happen, which may not actually be anything to do with what the public wants or needs. What's your argument for like your central planning?
Oh, well, I don't know whether I want to put a particularly strong argument for central planning. I mean, Hayek was in favor of central planning. That was a deliberately provocative statement. And what I mean by that is that Hayek was in favor of at the very least, a night watchman state. He was in favor of paying some kind of essential living amount to the poor. So all of those things require a government and they require central planning. One of the sad things about Hayek, I think, one of the unfortunate things about Hayek is that I very much buy into his critique of central planning, but what that leaves out is that central planning is inevitable. So yeah, big tick, Hayek shows us all, along with various others, that if the government owns everything, that's a complete nightmare. For Hayek's main focus was, well, early on, his main focus was economics, but he was happy to generalize that to politics, and that is an entirely, he's absolutely right about all that. But consider Ford Motor Company, consider the Australian government, the Swiss government, the New Zealand government, the Tongolese government, if I've got the word right. They're all centrally planned. And large centrally planned organizations have lots of problems, to quote Donald Trump. That's one of his favorite expressions, lots of problems. And so Hayek anatomized the problems of central planning, but there were at the time various green shoots of possibility where, so in the 19th century, railway companies in the United States particularly had built divisional structures. In fact, I think that goes back to the India companies in the Dutch and British India companies. One of the most exciting things in my lifetime, again, utterly past economists by, but it really excited me when I was working for John Button when he was industry minister. We were in the midst of this extraordinary thing that Toyota had done. And everyone was telling us, look, Toyota is landing cars into Australia. They must be dumped because you can't possibly build cars that cheaply that are that good.
Yeah.
And by way of something close to, I don't like bandying around expressions like new paradigm or revolution, but you're really getting quite close to this, that there wasn't a bunch of tips and tricks that these guys were up to. They had completely changed the way they did things. And just as Hayek essentially praises markets as bottom-up emergent forms of organization or disorganization, if you like,
Yeah.
The people who built the Toyota production system, obviously they weren't going to blow up central planning. Ultimately, it was still a centrally planned system, but what they put immense thought and effort, and I'll use that word again, humility, into understanding that it was the workers on the line, it was consumers, their customers, their suppliers knew so much more than the senior managers and the senior designers at the center of the company. And they built an entire philosophy and then an entire working system around empowering, encouraging, orchestrating that knowledge at the edge of the system.
Yeah.
And you'd think that would be something that Austrian economists would be interested in, wouldn't you? But they're not. And nor are neoclassical economists, because to a neoclassical economist, all that has happened is that there's been a rightward shift of the supply curve. Well, what happened at Toyota has been an endless source of fascination with me. It reminds me of Adam Smith's discussion in The Wealth of Nations about all of the different relationships, sharecropper, tenant and vassal, or, and landlord, employee, employer. He goes through sort of chapters of these different relationships. And here you saw in Toyota going from an employee-employer relationship to a much more relational and collaborative relationship. It had many of the, it's not nirvana. It didn't sort of usher in human happiness for all time, but it was very much part of that Enlightenment story where human cooperation, human autonomy, human capability all grow together. And that's hats off to these guys. Give them a Nobel Prize. They did something really massive. And since then, we've seen some other new developments as far as this bottom-up approach is concerned, because we've got things like peer production on Wikipedia, open source software, lots of really interesting new ways of liberating the edge, if you like. I find them fascinating and really quite inspiring.
Yeah, thanks for that. You gave a very good insight of how that model should work with the incentives. Just on a note, when it comes to like your local communities, how much do you think they should have autonomy in managing their economic environment? Like, could they control their own currency and they're in, like, they could have a workforce, or do you think that it should still be handled by central, like, government?
Well, I think where I think there's quite a useful analogy. Obviously, it's if you wanted to send me up, it would be easy to do so. But there's quite a useful analogy with a human body. So, a human body, or any body, the body of a mammal or a reptile or something. If you think about the blood system, you have arteries and you have capillaries, and it's these things are not very contestable inside a biological system, because it's evolved for the last few 100 million years, and we're at some kind of endpoint, although ultimately it will continue to evolve. Societies evolve a lot faster than that, but there isn't a yes/no answer to that. The answer is that there will always be some things that are better handled close by. So there will always be some case for some degree of subsidiarity, and then there are national systems or large international systems, and I think that's because there are very big economies from that. That's good. That's fine. I know you're interested in, as Hayek was interested in, sort of separate currencies and multiple currencies and things like that. Yeah. I certainly can't describe myself as an expert about it, but all the thinking that I've done about that leads me to believe that I'm not at all convinced. Now, blockchain might change some of the economics, and that's worth thinking about. But I think Hayek was absolutely barking up the wrong tree with the idea of multiple currencies. And I think we can see enough about why that is. So consider the competition, competition between Harvard and some little university that might have aspirations to be a great university in Kentucky.
Yeah.
Or consider the competition between Deloitte and Lateral Economics, or Deloitte and KPMG, or something like that. Now, so these currencies, so now I'm talking about Hayek's idea that you have different currencies, and the one that proves it's like a free banking argument. The one that proves that it's the most robust is the one that everybody wants to deal with. And now this system tends to monopoly all the time. In some ways, perhaps a better analogy here, but they're all, I could use these analogies in different ways to look at different parts of the problem, but perhaps a better analogy here is Facebook.
Yeah.
There's only going to be one Facebook. Facebook might get successfully challenged. I think it's pretty unlikely in my, well, I don't know about my lifetime, but in the foreseeable future. But there is an inherent tendency to monopoly there. And there are inherent tendencies to monopoly in lots of things. I mean, the language that we speak, there is an inherent tendency to monopoly. So standards are a public good.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are all kinds of tendencies to monopoly, and very muted. You can always set up competition, but when you really look at it, if you thought about competition between currencies, it's extremely like competition between banks in a free banking system. And yes, there have been experiments when it's sort of survived for a while. And I certainly don't want to say that our current banking system is anything to get too excited about. But the idea that that there's a sort of one answer for everything, even though you can see very heavy, very profound reasons for expecting market failure, that means you're just not in a world where these presumptions work. And so you've got to get more serious. You've got to get more curious about the world. You've got to get more humble about your knowledge and just try and do the best you can with what you know.
Sure. Nick, I mean, obviously we're going to go into a little bit more depth in here, but I'm just going to just give a couple of just very small punts of what you've just said there, because I haven't even explained my position really, so it'll just be a bit tricky for the audience to grasp where we're coming from just yet. But I guess the difference where my position may stand is the fact that society has a choice of who will be the leading, and it's not one currency, multi-currencies, because the currency doesn't necessarily work as the means to exchange value. It also provides other social goods as well, maybe just representing a company that produces something as well. So it not necessarily, there's a lot of contextual things which are working here in that respect. And then the other thing is that if a currency establishes itself as being very good, very it does the social good, it does the distribution well, it holds its value, I don't necessarily have an issue with the fact that it might have a certain monopoly on the sector, particularly if it's decentralized. So it's joint ownership. It's not some big profiteering person right in the center.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, we can go into this in a little bit later. If you don't mind, we can just go into this a little bit later. I've got notes on this anyway, because I just want to just stick to the plan for the meantime.
Sure, that's fine.
Because we got a whole session of this later on down our questions. Now, one of the things you mentioned just at the start, was democracy via appointee.
Well, democracy by lot, by random selection.
Yeah. Now, I guess like for the voting public, I think you've got a good point here, because they get this watered down version of democracy where basically they get a paper vote where they can really only kick out the government every 3 years. And it's only really a choice of getting rid of an incompetent government, really, rather than choosing a government that's going to do well. You're really just hoping that a government doesn't mess up too much. We've got a society where we've got the technology. We could have instant referendums where we're voting in laws. We've got the technology, but why do we need all these representatives making the decisions for us? Particularly when they are, well, we know it's established throughout history and ancient time that they're susceptible to fraud and manipulation.
So that's right. I think there is a lot wrong, and it seems to be increasingly wrong with government, with representative government via elections, and in a very broad brush, you can identify two possible ways to head that are consistent with democracy. I mean, I suspect the way we're heading is towards a sort of Chinese democracy, or a Singaporeese democracy, which is that we keep the people happy. The government sort of lives in terror that the people aren't happy. But apart from that, there isn't much democracy. But it's a kind of high service society, if you know what I mean. It's not a kind of massively dystopian world like the Eastern Bloc used to be. It's prosperous. People go shopping. If they don't give the government any trouble, they lead happy, prosperous lives. So I think that's the direction that democracy looks like it is taking. There are two ways in which we can take our current system more towards democracy or try and heal it. One is what you've suggested, and we do have the technology now to build truly participatory democracy. And you might like to have a discussion with me now. On my own view about that is that would make our current problems worse.
Right.
And that comes out of an analysis of what those problems are. And the other way is to do what the Athenians did. And the Athenians had a constitution a little bit like the American Constitution with checks and balances as far as the eye could see. But other than the ecclesia, which is often represented as the supreme lawmaking body, which is the council of all citizens, that's the participatory democracy part, it's not quite true. It was hemmed in by bodies that were chosen by lot. And the Boule, which was a council of 500 people chosen by lot, but carefully chosen by lot so that they represented the 10 tribes, the 10 tribes in Athens, or former tribes in Athens. They would prepare the notice paper for the ecclesia. They were sort of an executive for making the place. They were the government, if you like. They ran the garbage collection and maintained monuments and all kinds of things like that. Now the Athenians were very wary of the meritocracy that is implicit in elections, because they felt that would mean ultimately the Athenian democracy is more jealous of protecting itself from oligarchy than any democracy we know today. And the idea was that people had to participate in government, not just vote for the government. And in fact, the word we have, there was a Greek word, idiotes, which was used for people who had no concern other than their own private business, and particularly their business, no interest in the public life of the city. And that's where we get our word idiot from. So they were tremendously keen on trying to make sure that everyone was part of a government, that people governed and were governed, and everyone did some of both. So I think that sort of approach has hugely healing properties for the system we've got. Perhaps I can explain why, by way of a detour, by having my little discussion with you about why I think participatory democracy via the internet would make things worse.
Sure.
But what do you think?
Yeah, so Just from your side, you know when you say these appointees, so are these, how many of them are representing us? Isn't it? I mean, I'm just, the thing that's just coming up to mind right now is like, don't we have this when we elect our ministers in local elections and stuff?
No, that's a process which the founding fathers of America described as aristocratic, because it is electing an elite. It is saying we want an elite to run us, but we at least want to have some say in who that elite is.
Yeah.
So both Montesquieu described electoral electoral systems as partially aristocratic. The great hope that people like Jefferson and Madison had on the founding of America, and Adams, is that when you elect people, you get a natural aristocracy, was the term that some of them used, because the people will vote for the best sort, and that creates the natural aristocracy. So, I mean, that's the theory. We all know if you think Donald Trump is a natural aristocrat, then I'll go he. But that was the thinking. So when you're thinking of what I'm talking about, I'm talking, just think of a jury. So we want the community represented in a court case about a man who is alleged to have murdered his wife. We want the community there. We want judges. We want the accused to have a professional advocate to defend them. We want the Crown to have a professional advocate to mount the prosecution. And we want the community there to ensure that this process, when we come out of it, and the community can say, well, look, I don't know all the facts. I'm too busy to know that. I'm busy with my own work. I know there were 12 people like me there, and 11 out of the 12 said he was guilty, and that's good enough for me. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking.
So let me play a little scenario for you. So let's just say that a bill is trying to be passed to bring in capital punishment. How would that be organised?
Okay, so let me now sort of skip to my model of what I'd like to see, and it's obviously, if you, I don't want anyone to think that I'm expecting people to listen in from around the world to this podcast and take down notes and implement what I say. But we're just trying to structure that. That's right. From small things, big things grow.
Yeah.
But let's just say I'm very inured to this being a small thing at the moment, but I'm sketching it out to make it clear what I'm talking about. So if you take the Australian system at the moment, I'll describe it for people who are listening who from this country or other countries that don't know what it is. It's a Westminster system imported from the United Kingdom. It has a lower house in the United Kingdom. That's called the House of Commons. Here it's called the House of Representatives. That's elected from the people. And there is an upper house called the Senate, and that is elected by the people as well, but with equal amounts of representation for each of the states, no matter what size they have. What I would do is that I would either replace the Senate or add to the Senate a chamber of 299 Australians chosen to be randomly to be somewhat representative. So there would be a appropriate pro rata number from Western Australia and Tasmania and Victoria, and there'd be roughly 51% women and 49% men, and so on and so forth. But apart from that, they would be randomly chosen.
Just so you just get a letter in the mailbox.
Correct. And then there's a debate about whether you compel people to attend. I don't want to compel people to attend. So people can say, sorry, I'm not up for that. I'm too shy, or I'm too greedy, or I'm too this, or I'm too that.
Yeah.
And you end up with 299 people. So then what I would do is this is a House of Parliament that has the same kinds of powers. It goes through the notice paper. And according to Westminster approach to government, which is similar in the presidential systems, to legislate, you go through the Houses of Parliament and you get the executive, the sovereign, to assent, the president in the United States. This chamber, I don't think I'd give it much power at all if it had a simple majority. I might give it a 3-month delaying power. The House of Lords has a 12-month delaying power. I get interested in what might happen when you have a clear supermajority in the People's Chamber. What that is showing you is that if there's a clear majority of the people in the People's Chamber and they disagree with the elected representatives, well, for a start, that's a pretty important bit of information, that the elected representatives have a disagreement with the considered opinion of average citizens. So the first thing I would do, and I'm quite proud of this because it's so natty, the first thing I would do is I would allow the People's Chamber, the one that's chosen by sortition, to impose upon the other chamber or chambers a secret ballot. Now, what I have in mind here is the situation that occurred in Australia in the 2013 Parliament. We think of Brexit and Trump as the vanguards of the new level of dysfunction in our polities. But in its true pioneering form, Australia's often ahead of the game, as we were with the Third Way and with a bunch of other things. And in 2013, the most important task that the 2013 Parliament gave itself was to abolish carbon pricing, because that had been a convenient whipping boy, a convenient scare for the opposition at the time. And so it proceeded to do that. Now, what I would like you and listeners to ponder is the fact that at the time that they passed this legislation, 80 or 90, something, certainly an incredibly comfortable majority, but probably 80 or 90% of our elected representatives knew that that wasn't in the public interest, knew that that was a piece of policy vandalism. That is a remarkable thing, and it's remarkable that this system, which was thought to be aristocratic and meritocratic, has such toxic feedback with, media, social media, and all this kind of stuff, that we can get ourselves into a situation like that. And I'm very confident, I can't prove it, but I'm very confident that if 299 average Australians had listened to the story that the Abbott government had to tell about why it was giving up $10 billion a year of government revenue and some reasonably efficient way to meet targets that the Australian government had agreed to, and instead, while agreeing to the targets, then proposed to spend $2.5 billion on a cockamamie subsidy scheme to subsidise polluters to pollute a little less, they would have said, sorry, this is ridiculous. This is an absurdly bad piece of policy. And there are lots and lots of reasons why these kinds of mechanisms, juries, citizens' chambers, why they bring a completely different approach. It's not just the the way you make them up. The whole way, you see, to be elected, you have to beat somebody else in an election. So that inherently focuses people's minds on how they can disagree with somebody and beat them, whether they might represent their policies accurately, more likely, somewhat inaccurately. If you're in a jury or a citizen's chamber, that's not your problem at all. You're sitting there and you're saying, is this guy guilty or not? Well, let's talk and let's have a debate and let's see where we get to. Or if you're in a citizen's chamber, the question is, should we cut expenditure, put up taxes? If we put up taxes, should we put them up on the rich or the poor or on consumption or something else? And then you have a debate, and most people are in the spirit to try and work it out.
Yeah.
And that's the last thing on the minds of the members of the House of Commons or the House of Representatives or anywhere else. So these are profoundly different ways of solving social problems. And as an economist could tell you, like an economist like me could tell you, that having a competitive side to our democracy could be a feature. At the moment, it's so competitive, it's so obsessed with competition when we're trying to solve a unitary problem, which is, should the country invade Iraq or do this or do that, it's so competitive that it's become deranged. And there is this other side of the human makeup, which is let's try and work out what we can agree on best. And that's not the kind of logic that you would ever expect to really see in an electoral system. You sometimes see it when a country is at war.
Yeah.
But this is just getting worse and worse and worse. And this is a powerful way of recentering our democracy on solving problems rather than creating them and taking advantage of them.
Yeah, I agree with you. I actually like that idea. I've got two arguments against it, though.
That's good that you've got an argument against it. It's not all good, so it's good that you've got the argument against it.
Yeah. Now this one I think is an easy one to rebut against, but you can just I'll have a go at this one.
Yep.
I'm a lobbyist, and I see that there's these people probably not very wealthy.
Yep.
I'm going to just go straight over to them. I need this bill passed. I'm going to take them out to a very nice restaurant. So I invite them to parties, all this kind of stuff. Hey, this thing that's being passed. I'm behind that. Do you, can you support this bill?
Help me out.
Yeah. How do you stop that one still? Because they still got the power.
You're completely right. You're completely right. So my arguments are all second best arguments. I can't knock you out of the park. I can't say, Charles, you're just deluded and here's the answer. So that's obviously something you need to keep in mind because human beings are fallen creatures, sadly. And what I would say is, firstly, you criminalise the worst of that behaviour, as it has been criminalised with representatives. And beyond that, and you can be pretty vigilant about that, beyond that, I would say this, that I recall when the micro parties managed to regularly get, well, they've still got a regular, anyway, where the micro parties you would regularly get 4 or 5 Senate seats in Australia. Now, these are parties like the Motorists Enthusiast Party. And people would firstly ridicule these the people who got in, and they're certainly not the kind of people I would immediately think of as a great balm to our democracy. But in fact, what happened is that they were really quite good at listening to the arguments and doing what you might have thought Parliament was there for, to debate arguments and try and deliberate on where we come down. Secondly, there were various attempts to browbeat these people by the establishment, and they would put them in an invidious position and say, if you don't vote for this, we will have a double dissolution and that's going to make it much harder for you to get elected. And that's what happened to Ricky Muir. And he didn't flinch. He thought, as most people do, and certainly not everyone, but most people are incredibly honoured to be in that position, much more so than, the people who are in the career track to go into the elected representative role. They've been well oiled by local developers and by the party machine that very early on teaches people that their views are pretty incidental to doing what their party says. So all I can say is that remains an enduring problem of any system, but I think that's already more of a problem in the existing system than it would likely be in a system where people are chosen by lot and then disappear. And, they're there for one term and then, it's true you can try and bribe them, in which case if they take the bribe, they will have committed an offence and they might be detected. But then as they complete their term, no one's got any interest in bribing them. They've no power. They're just, because they're there for a temporary period, they may as well give it their best shot. And you can't say that for any of these other politicians other than lame duck presidents, I suppose, and lame duck governance. You can't say, and anyway, those guys have got a lot of power by the end of that process. You can't say that they've got nothing, that they've got nothing to lose. With everyone else, their political power is a function of their careers, their continuing career success. And it is via that mechanism that corruption, the sort of discipline that managed to deliver Australia's carbon pricing system to the dustbin, it's from those kinds of forces that comes. The way in which politicians must honour their careers if they're to be successful politicians. And by successful, I mean that in both its good sense and its not so good sense.
Yeah. And the other argument is, look, there's two ways to take this really. When you've got a majority party, then they can pass all the bills and make the big changes in government and society. Now, if you've got this people's representatives coming in, they're going to act more of a roadblock to actual change. Now, as I said, there's two ways of looking at it. If it's a load of crap they're trying to pass, then it's a good thing. They're going to keep on roadblocking it. But if it's something that might actually be advantageous, then this will limit the innovation that government might actually have. Now, that might not necessarily be a bad thing, but it's just, it sounds a little bit like a hindrance.
No, look, I think it's true, and I think that Australians, of all people, have an appreciation of that, because I think Australia's constitution is one of the best in the world in the sense that it delivers fairly strong government, but it does have quite a strong House of Review, as opposed to the British and the New Zealand constitution until recently, in which it was possible to lurch left and right quite strongly. So firstly, when you give that much power to people, you tend to create a kind of a strong pendulum swing, and that can be destabilizing and unfortunate. And the other thing is that politics, if you've ever got close to it, has its own laws, and making good policy for the people is just one of them. It's sometimes a bit of a sidelight. And certainly I've worked for very good politicians, but every politician I've ever worked for was the thing that really got them up in the morning was the politics, was winning the political battles. That was fascinating to them. And if they could do it with good policy rather than bad policy, they would. But their passions were all in the politics. So that's what I'd say about that. It's also true, of course, that there are some countries, some European countries, where it's kind of accepted, or it's widely accepted. I'm sure some people wouldn't accept it, but it's fairly well accepted that Italy is an example where you can't get a strong enough government to do anything much. And so that definitely can be a problem. But as far as the evidence is concerned, federations seem to do better than unitary states, and likewise bicameral systems of checks and balances tend to do better than systems with very strong nodes of power. You don't get that many Lee Kuan Yews in a generation. I mean, in his generation, I think we only got one. And most people who end up with that kind of power make life worse, not better, for the amount of power they get. But there are exceptions, and if we could be confident that we had someone like Mr. Lee, for all his, and he's not without sin, but if you're in the position of Singapore in 1960, then I'd make an exception for Lee Kuan Yew, but not for many others.
Yeah. I've noticed on reading through a few of your blog posts, you go into depths about how there's a symbiotic nature between the public and private goods. Could you just give us some
Absolutely. I love
that?
this. So I have a description of the world, and I can give it to you in one sentence. It's a description of the economic world. It's also a description of the social world. This is the sentence. The world is a nested ecology of public and private goods. So imagine you are standing with me on the steps of the State Library in Victoria. I will describe the scene to you. There are two very large checkerboards in front of us, and four people are playing two games of chess on those pieces. There are people, this is in a park in front of the State Library, and there are people sitting on park benches. Some of them are sitting together, some of them are sitting on their own, some have brought sandwiches, some haven't brought sandwiches. There are trams going by. There are people in coffee shops nearby. Pick one of those things, and I will tell you about how. Pick one of any of those things I've described, and I will tell you why it is an ecology of public and private goods. Go.
You mentioned four people playing chess, or is it just four different boards?
Yeah? Well, no. This is two games of chess being played by two people each.
On the same board or two different
No,
boards?
no. I complicated it too much. Let's say there's one checkerboard and there are two people playing chess on it. It's
Right,
it's a large, each square is 2 feet square.
Yeah.
Each square on the board. So it's a one of those you've seen those around in parks and so on with great big pieces. So there's a game of that going on.
Yeah.
So do you want me to take that?
Yeah, let's focus on that one.
Okay. So what we have there is we have two people. The two people are competing. Their competition is for the private good of beating the other person. They're trying to advantage themselves. But they don't get anywhere without the public good of the game of chess. The game of chess itself evolved through through Europe, I think, possibly out of India about a millennium ago, is a global public good. It's there, it's free, it's non-rival, anyone can play it. We can't stop people playing it unless we put them in handcuffs. So that's a public good. The government, or maybe a philanthropist, built the chess board that they're playing on and provided the chess pieces that they're playing on. People will come round and look, and then they might join. One side might come up and say, you should play pawn to king 4 for the opening move like Bobby Fischer always did, or mostly did. And then they will be building a public good with the person whose side they've taken, and they will be a team seeking to compete with the other side, and they will, in that sense, be participating in a private good. They'll have money in their pocket, and that money will largely be a private good, but can be converted to a public good very easily. And they're participating in a game which has some aspects of public good about it, in the sense that it's a collective entity. It's not they can't do it on their own. No one can have the experience except in the context of somebody else having the experience, like this conversation.
Yeah.
So in this conversation, we might compete. I might decide that I've had enough of this and I want to go and watch the television.
Yeah.
Those are all the things that are within my private purview. I might want to go up and go to the toilet, any number of things. At the same time, there is no point in us doing what we're doing if we're not both accepting and understanding that there is publicness between us. Forget about the listeners at the moment. Yeah. There is a publicness in this conversation. My conduct doesn't make any sense unless I'm trying to build something with you.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we all end up that my aspiration is that we all end up agreeing about everything, but the thing that we build, we use this public good called language and the internet, for instance, and that's what we're communicating over. And then you and I work away at creating something which is more than stuff that's just me and more than stuff that's just you. Now, can you see why the world is a nested ecology of public and private goods?
Yes.
And doesn't it drive you nuts that economists and policy discussion tells you, well, whose side do you want to take, public goods or private goods? What the hell is going on? That's a ridiculous. It just shows how the sense has been drained out of a conversation by ideology. That's my pronouncement.
Something that's coming into mind is just like with philosophy, is that like you start off by saying that people all work for their self-interest, so they're all agents of self-interest.
Yeah.
However, with more wisdom and more understanding of the world, it's best to work for society, work for the collective, and therefore there's a reciprocal relationship between the two, and you look after the community, they look after you, and even though you're looking after your own self-interest, it all just spins around in a big cycle.
Well, yeah, but even that way of putting it is fairly crude, because what happens is if someone's going to work, often they will be a husband or a wife. They will have people who they accept very strong obligations to, their mother, their children, or whatever. Then they might be a member of a local choir or a local football club. And what will they do? They'll take their money and they'll go and they'll put it in the can or whatever. They'll pay their dues, and then they will be part of this other thing. Now, you can tell a voluntaristic story about that. I'm not, as you probably gathered by now, I'm not really interested in shoehorning the discussion one way or the other. But the fact is that, and I'm not telling you old people are naturally altruistic or any of those things. I'm just saying people are rich, and the evidence we have, the evidence we have as far as people's money is concerned is, as far as them and society is concerned, they, what do we know? We know that they keep almost all the money they earn for themselves. They vote for governments that then take about 40% of the money off them, and they give away about 1% of their money to good causes. So that's another sort of framework. If you want to generalize, that's what we see in pretty much every Western country. So altruism as a pure instinct is, as Adam Smith said, an ornament, not a foundation. Basic kinds of self-interest, but better interpreted through Smith's Stoic lens, to think of it as basic prudence in one's life, is most of what one's private financial affairs are about, and that will involve very strong obligations to family members and much weaker obligations to others. And then there is prudence exercised as a member of a community, in which case you vote for people who are going to take away about 40% of your wealth in order to care for the poor and the sick and help you bring up your kids and keep you safe at night and so on.
Okay, well, thanks for giving that.
Let me just say one other thing, because I wrote a blog post I quite liked when I came across a term that's doing the rounds rather a lot in prehistory and or in primatology and speculation about human origins, and that is the idea of collective intention. Now, it seems that human beings are unique in having a strong capacity to arrive at a collective intention. I think it is the case that no one has ever seen a primate, unless they've trained the primate, no one has ever seen something as simple as a primate holding down a branch for another primate to pick some fruit from. What you see human beings do from a pretty early age, about 3 or maybe earlier, maybe a bit later, is you see this public good business go on. You see 2 little girls sitting together and they say, let's play a game and let's build a castle and on the, a sandcastle, and then they cooperate.
Yeah.
And they're not cooperating out of, it's completely wrong to call that altruistic cooperation. And so that's why I continue to get frustrated when people contrast altruism, which in my opinion is very weak, with selfishness, which is very strong, because collective intention is also very strong. If we want to measure it, the figures I just gave you, 60% of our money goes to private, to our private needs, and 40% goes to social needs in most Western democracies.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty big tick for collective intention. That tells you that we are creatures for whom collective intention is a big deal. Go see a football match and tell me that collective intention doesn't move people strongly.
Yeah, I'm with you on this one as well. So just, I guess this question does link in a way. Now, when it comes to competition and the environment of competition, now obviously we've just spoken about the subject of private and public goods, but it'll be interesting to merge this one into this next question. To which degree should government foster an environment of competition?
Well, I think where markets work well, competition should always be presumed to be a good thing, and there might be some circumstances where it turns out it isn't. But typically, in lots of simple situations, more competition is good. However, it's only in the last year or so occurred to me how misguided it is to project competition. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do. I'll finish my sentence. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Right.
It's misguided to take something like running schools or hospitals or social welfare programs and say, well, surely more competition is better than less competition. The only way in which more competition is better than less competition is if other things are equal. But we know that other things are not equal, because this is never going to be close to a marketplace that won't have strong elements of market failure in it. And as I've thought about it, so my first thought about this was that this was the problem. We in Australia, we've been having an inquiry by a major government commission into competition policy. And as a brilliant idea, the people who were appointed to this body said that we should have more competition in supermarkets and restaurants and petrol stations and all those things where we all agree that more competition is better. And then they said, and so long as we're sure nothing's wrong, there should be more competition in all these other areas of delivery of social services. Now, I don't want to arc up and say, oh no, competition is absolutely the wrong thing to do. What I want to point out there is that there might well be areas where more competition is better. We don't know where they are. The inquiry didn't seem to show too much curiosity about figuring out where it's really confident that more competition would be better. What we know in these systems, in the Australian school system, we know that we're not very good at schooling compared with the best in the world. So we'd better get curious about what it is that makes us not the best in the world, because it doesn't seem to have much to do with competition. It has a lot to do, it seems, with the qualifications and the status of teachers, the resources available to teaching, the treatment, it seems, of some of the least advantaged kids. Most of the school systems that are very good overall are very good at picking up the people at the bottom, which our system is particularly bad at. One of the things you would expect if you intensify competition is that we'll get worse at that. So as I thought about this, I thought, firstly, this is putting the cart before the horse. And I was very taken with a metaphor that Gary Sturgis uses, Gary Sturgis being a commentator on the Australian scene and a veteran public servant of some decades. And he says, you should think of the school system or the NDIS, the National Disability the National Disability Scheme. You should think of these things not as markets in the first instance, but as supply chains. So Ford and Toyota don't sit there and say, how can we be more like a market? They accept that they're centrally planning what they do. They know what they're doing, which is to build cars. They know they're trying to build the best possible car they can for the lowest possible price. And they understand everything about building a car. And then they go, right, well, we can contract out tires. There's a good market there. We can maybe develop a good market somewhere else. But they do it from a position of knowledge, and they do it from a position of understanding that ultimately the risk falls upon them. They can't, if you have to have a big fat recall, nobody wants to hear that there was this company that gave us dodgy brakes. Ford just says, we've got dodgy brakes in the cars. You've got to bring them back. We'll fix them, and we won't make any profits for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
And so that was the first point, to say that, yes, of course, it would be good in some situations to intensify competition. There are probably some areas where we should de-intensify competition, but we don't know any of that unless we take a real curious and rigorous look at what the hell it is we're doing, until we understand what we're doing, and we're a long way from being able to do that. So that's the first point. But the second point is to start, and I've sort of intimated this already, but the second point is to realize that the most important thing about your school system, and this will sound like a platitude to you, Charles, but I will say it anyway. The most important thing about your school system is what? That it teaches kids, that it educates kids. And the most important thing about the school system isn't how competitive it is. That might have something to do with how good it is looked at in different ways. But that's what it's there for. And when I sort of started thinking about this, and I happened to sort of happen upon this, and I can send you the link, I may already have done so, but I sort of started thinking about this because I started reading a bit of feminist economics, and I don't really want to recommend a lot of that to people, but I didn't read a lot of it myself, but I happened upon a book called The Ethics of Care.
Right.
And it led, and this, there's a critique by Carol Gilligan in the late 70s, early 80s, which and this was about ethics, and she basically rebelled against. That's a somewhat silly way to put it, but she. I'm just looking for that term they use about artists, but anyway, she rejected her male tutor, her male mentor, who had a big theory of ethics which was rule-based, and she eventually concluded that was the way men thought about ethics. Men thought about ethics, which is what rules can we make? Think of Immanuel Kant. What rules can we make that we can generalize and impose upon everyone? And her argument was that women think about these things in terms of human relations and the proximity of relations, the closeness of relations, the obligations of care, and stuff like that. And encountering this, I just thought a penny dropped, and I thought, oh yeah, a hospital, a school, a social security department is about delivering care. That's what it's about. And then we have to, that's by no means the end of the story. It doesn't mean that the big prize goes to the person who can speak most sentimentally about that question. It's still a hard-headed question. How do we deliver that care? But that's the question, not how do we make this thing look like a market? Yeah. Not where are the market failures and where do we fix them? It is we have a need to deliver educational care and instruction at scale. We have a need to deliver medical care at scale. We have a need to deliver social, some kind of social healing where families are in crisis and kids are not getting parented with anything like adequate parenting. How do we do that? Yeah. How hard is it? What are the technologies for doing this? And poncing about and saying, oh, well, we've worked out that we don't have asymmetric information, but we do have economies of scale, and those are the market failure problems. Well, I don't want to say that you should never engage in that sort of thought, but that shouldn't be the first question. This is about, it's as simple as that. And when you think about that more, you realize that more and more the great trick of economics, and it is a great trick and it's a very powerful trick, is to actually not get too interested in whether you're making potato chips or silicon chips. And a lot of times that's a feature, not a bug, because governments can't know everything about every damn market they go into. Yeah. But we've so inured ourselves to that way of thinking that we've made it normal to think in this highly abstract way about very concrete things. And as a result, we end up with all these economists, mainly men, pontificating about school systems and hospital systems. And, they've looked at a few numbers and they might look impressive on TV, but they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah. One thing I remember you just mentioned here is about creating a level playing field. And when you just mentioned competition, I was just trying to think of different things in life that we experience when there's a great example of competition which is happening. And you get it sometimes in sport, sometimes in business, sometimes it's quite a rare phenomenon, really,
Sublime.
Isn't it? It's brilliant when it happens, but it's very rare when it happens.
You gave us songs like "Help" and "Yesterday."
Yeah, and you get this. It's basically like they're pioneers. They're right at the highest standards, but there's almost an equivalent that's just beside them at the same time, and that spurs them on together. Now, that's an amazing thing if that could ever be fostered by central planning. But then I think to myself, well, if you just create this environment where, all right, okay, everyone compete with each other, there's nothing worse than just being outclassed by somebody and you're just like, oh, I can't, this is a struggle now. This
Yeah,
person, like
yeah,
it's like playing tennis against Federer or something. You're just like,
yes,
oh,
yeah,
I'm not going to win this one. You're going to have a much better game playing against somebody at your level, and then working your way up gradually, rather than just going
yes,
against the
yes,
best.
yes. And society is not a game of tennis.
Yeah.
And this is a mistake that, when a lot of discussion about trade is of course famously mistaken in the analogy of trade with sport, where in sport there's a winner and a loser, and in trade, in most configurations of trade, there is a winner and another winner. So that's there's something analogous to be said about a society, which is we want our Federers and Nadals to have their rivalries to drive their performance ever and ever up. But that's, there are lots of, if we're trying to look at the welfare of a community, then firstly, we don't want that humiliating all the people who never were going to be any good at tennis. We need to be thinking about a world in which they find something which they can feel that they're making a contribution and make a contribution. And again, I think markets are, as we've encountered them, I suppose, well, they are engines of great diversity, of course, but I think, think about the market for fast food. It's also a great homogenizer and a great optimizer. And there are lots of things about our lives which it's great to optimize to a certain degree. It might be great to optimize as much as in the age of, in the first 5 years of McDonald's hamburgers, probably absolutely every bit of the optimizing they did was good. And then after 40 and 50 years, this juggernaut is just endlessly optimized. It's transforming our culture. It's toxifying bodies. And it's being run by quite decent people who are just sort of plying their trade and keep finding that market forces push them into manipulative advertising, addictive food. I use the word addictive somewhat loosely. You know what I mean? And it's a trap. We've built a trap. But so it's the world is much richer than a tennis match. But I was only watching some of Roger Federer's best shots about 2 hours ago, so I certainly get pleasure out of those.
All right. So I think it's good to just understand like what are we trying to get out of like setting these standards and goals and having this view of economics. So probably the most important question you can ask most economists is what are the main benchmarks to attain for a prosperous, high living standard society?
Mm. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't want to, I don't want to be too countercultural here. Living standards are very important. I guess I feel about that question something a bit like what my father brought me up to believe, which is that money is very important until you've got enough of it, at which point it becomes pretty unimportant, and in some ways important for the wrong kinds of reasons because it generates its own kind of momentum. So there are. I don't want to romanticize poverty or any of those things. I don't want to romanticize having a standard of living which is, say, half or a quarter of mine, even though Adam Smith would have regarded that as an incredible luxury, even for himself, let alone for the people. I mean, Adam Smith wrote in 1790 or 1776 that quite poor workmen are not anywhere near subsistence, and that most of the things that they have above subsistence, their most significant aspect is not the utility they bring, but the social approbation. That's a remarkable statement for a society which we would think of as so poor.
Yeah.
So I'm all in favour. I live a privileged life. I have a fair bit of money, and I don't want to romanticize anything having lots less money than that. But I must say, in my lifetime, something quite kind of something quite paradoxical has occurred. It's something which Marx would have predicted, and I think almost all other economists wouldn't have predicted, which is that as we get richer, as the economy gets richer, we become more, not less, concerned with money. And that's a very deep kind of sickness. I don't have any crash course in how to solve it. And we live in a democracy, and if I did try and put people on a crash course to solve it, they would very quickly dispose of me. But it's just something to keep in mind. It's a very unfortunate thing, I think.
I remember hearing about these studies that have happened in these communities before, where they do the slight social experiments, and they find, like, if they give everybody the same wage, they try and measure their happiness, and those societies seem to fare quite well. Like, and then also there's a factor that comes into play whereby social standing doesn't necessarily represent of you becoming very wealthy straight over time. It's just a case of your social order. So
that's right.
If you
and that's come under some pressure. I would say that was much stronger when I was a kid than it is now, where money is a much stronger signal. Whereas when I was a kid, there were lots of institutions. You know, if you were a teacher, you were respectable, and that was something that people valued a good deal. You could be a shopkeeper, a pharmacist. You could be in the army, in the church, in a university. All these institutions that had their own. You could be a nurse, you could be a doctor. I think they're much less. They matter much less now, and how much money you've got is much more important to people now. And I think that's a real pity, because people get their happiness once they achieve a certain level of economic income. Their happiness comes from their sense of esteem among their peers, their feeling of being part of being a worthwhile part, a respected part of a community, all those kinds of things. And these are, if you think about them, these are mostly public goods. This is why Adam Smith wrote a whole book about culture called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. They're not easy things to, in other words, your happiness is in the hands of other people to a very large extent. If you might have to behave well to deserve their esteem, but they then have to have the decency to esteem you, even though you're not earning a lot of money. And a society that doesn't have people who will do that is a society that's going to be more unhappy. Let me give you a stat. It's from memory, so I can't give it to you exactly, but I recall there's a book called, it's not The Culture of Narcissism, because that was written by Christopher Lasch in the 70s, but it's a book on narcissism, and you might remember the name, and I can look it up and get back to you on it. But it was written about 7 or 8 years ago, I think, and a woman, but I just remember a factoid from it in which somebody saw a survey done of university students going back to 1977 or 1972 or something, and there was a question of students, and the question was, well, it was an assertion, and then you had to say how important it was to you, which is, I want to be very wealthy, or I don't know whether it was very wealthy, but it wasn't just, comfortably off or anything like that. It's important to me to be wealthy, something like that. And in the 1970s, I think 45% of American college students gave that a tick and said yes, and now I think it's something like 79%. That's a big deal as far as I'm concerned. That is a really big deal. And, when I was a kid, there'd be kids going to school with me, and they wanted to be truck drivers and firemen and this kind of stuff, and nurses. And these days, those kids are going to be looked on as mugs because they're never going to get a nice house. Life's going to be tough for them. And if they're a great nurse, well, I'm sure the patients in the hospital will thank them very much, but no one will pay them the kind of respect that they were paid a generation ago.
We mentioned this a little while ago as well, and I think it was just a conversation with my grandparents, but it was going back some years now. But I remember them saying, even in this, like the Second World War, and you got the bombings over London, they always said that that was almost like, it sounds weird to say this, but it was
It was
almost
the
the happiest
happiest
time
time
of
of
their
their life.
life,
Yeah.
and they've never felt so alive
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
any other time other than that time. And it's because they felt like a contributing person in society for the national interest almost.
That's right.
And
That's
like we look as an economist, it's a really weird thing to look at, because you think, okay, well, we want to try and make a real prosperous, rich society, but these people feel like millionaires in comparison to what we have today.
That's right. I mean, of course, people can overdo it with nostalgia, but it's a very
Yeah,
well-known phenomenon. I've just been looking on my computer, and I don't think I'll be able to find it, but there's some marvelous quotes from a book which is called something like "Love in the Time of the Bombing" or something, and it's um, letters that people having affairs in London Literary Society during the Blitz.
yeah,
And of course, there's this tremendous sense of the fact that you might not wake up tomorrow and that you really need to lead your life.
yeah,
Um, and it's intoxicating, and it's sort of the way we should lead our lives, but we're all too scared to do it. And when you're really seriously scared, you do it. Um, so there is that sense. I mean, there's literature about this. I love the film Plenty, written by David Pear, about a woman who played by a British woman played by Meryl Streep when she was practicing her virtuosity with accents.
hmm,
And she is in the French Resistance. She's a British woman who's spent the last few years of the war in France in the French Resistance, and then she thinks the war's over. I'm going to go back to Britain and things will be better now. And of course, she finds they're not better.
yeah,
British life is full of the same kind of oppression, the same kind of life denying, straightening, busybody types, and
yeah,
she kind of goes a bit crazy. But yeah, it's true. It's true, and I mean, I think we had that in Australia in a small way. Um, Hardheads, economists, political scientists are always telling you that governments are very unpopular when they're imposing difficulty on people.
yeah,
But there are exceptions. Exceptions are obviously during wars, but also the most talented politician of my lifetime was in Australia was Bob Hawke, and Bob Hawke got in 1983 at the bottom of a very deep recession, and of course everything worked out brilliantly for him. But so the economy did recover. So in some senses, you could say it's not a very good experiment, but he got into power and he sold to the Australian electorate the idea. In fact, I think the slogan was restraint with equity. That is, we are paying ourselves too much, we are living beyond our means, and we can get on top of this by together as a society organizing for to restore the profit share of national income by restraining wages, and we would do that with a bargain between government and Labor, in which Labor agreed to give up real wages, to give up real wage increases until the problem was sorted, and in return to receive all sorts of social wage benefits like better social medicine and a range of superannuation and so on. In fact, I think the logic of that time, the political logic of that time, was what I was talking to you about earlier when I talked about electoral democracy versus democracy by lot.
hmm,
Because the Hawke government, because Hawke, somewhat pig-headedly against the advice of people like my father, most economists, and all the political hardheads, they all said an incomes policy won't work. It's been shown not to work in England. And he managed to put together this compact, which was called an accord between the Australian government and its union base. So it was an ALP government, a Labor Party government, a union base, it had as de facto members of that accord, that sort of agreement, you had business leaders, you had the bureaucracy, and to some extent you had the welfare lobby. And so those people then, when they met in a room, they weren't trying to think, how can I score points off somebody else? They were thinking, how do I get what I want for my constituents, and what am I prepared to give up to get it? And that's a much more attractive environment in which to get to a solution, in which everyone is asking themselves what I call, or answering what I call the Spice Girls question, which is, tell me what you want, what you really, really want. So there's no grandstanding, there's no taking advantage, there's struggle, there's conflict of interest, but with a view to coming up with a deal. And once you've got the deal, then, of course, the Liberal Party, that is the main opposition party at this time, was in complete despair, because once the Labor government had arranged a deal with the unions and business, and they kind of got it smoothed over, and, there'd be some rough edges and some tensions, but they'd have a deal, then the business people would go back to their people and say, shush, we put those arguments and we got what we could get. And we're getting a realignment of the real wage overhang. We're solving the problem of excess wages. And the unionists would say, go back to their workers and say, we're not going on strike for more wages. We might be able to get more wages, but we're getting better health care. And if we struck for more wages, we just make the economic problem worse, and we get more wages and 15% of us would be unemployed. And so the whole logic that we see so rarely was there for about a decade. That also happened in Ireland during its glory days, from about 87 until the European catastrophe, where there was some kind of squaring of the circle in this otherwise relentless polarization of politics, and it produced very good solutions. I mean, they're workaday solutions. They won't look all that good in an economic model, but they represent serious, powerful people trying to do the best they can for their constituents in a constructive environment, rather than one of relentless competition for advantage over others, in which the benefits for the society are incidental. The whole point of this process was to get something that everyone could live with and everyone thought was better than what they had at the start of the meeting.
All right. Here we go to policy, because you're all about policy with lateral thinking. Before setting one up, what kind of principles should be in someone's chain of reasoning?
Well, I don't know. I think I like to bounce backwards and forwards. I like to find out about things on the ground. Then I want to ask myself, how do I generalize those things? So that's how I worked with when I had this problem of what to do about the car industry. I talked a lot to the industry. The economists told me that was an evil thing to do, because the industry would just ask for special assistance. And guess what? That's exactly what the industry asked for, but I wasn't particularly interested in that. I would then say, all right, well, if you want us to give you this assistance, I don't think we will, but if we gave you half as much assistance, would you rather we gave it to you as tariffs or as export subsidies? And why? And then you quickly get into a situation where you're actually learning about the microeconomics of the industry, because guess what? The people who work in the industry, who have to sell cars in the industry, who have to import parts from Japan and Korea and the UK and Detroit, they know about the microeconomics of the industry a damn sight better than you do with your models as an economist from a desk.
Yeah.
And they know stories, and they can tell you stories, and they can start saying things to you like, well, reflect on this, that we sell a Mercedes 350 SE, that's the wrong number, but I don't know, 230D or something. We sell a Mercedes 230D here as a luxury car. This is back in the mid 80s, so let's say it was for $25,000, and that's the equivalent of about $70,000 today. And in Germany, they're all taxis. And that gives you something to think about. It wasn't something that economists were thinking about because, of course, that idea violates the law of one price. But that it was pondering that fact, and then, of course, needing to do the translation back into economics, because otherwise it's just a nice story. Who cares? So it's this dialogue between the facts on the ground, the stories that are circulating, the things that the lived experience of people with knowledge, either of their own lives or of the microeconomics of the industry, and then constantly, so you've got questions to ask the life world from your economic framework, and then you've got little surprises that happen to you, like the story about the Mercedes, and then you take that back to your framework and you go, okay, so how do I get that into my framework in a way that satisfies me intellectually? And what does it mean for whether we should have tariffs or export subsidies or what mix? And what does it mean for, this policy or that policy? And nobody was doing that.
Yeah. Now, I'm not trying to speak about like corrupt governments. We know where they go wrong with policy, but the governments who really got genuinely good intentions, where do they sometimes go wrong?
Well, I don't know. That's a kind of glass half full, glass half empty story. I don't think many governments have that good intentions. People who get into power have spent the last 15 years going to meetings, dealing with self-interested people, and trying to strike deals with them. I don't mean, and by deals, I don't mean they don't sign on the dotted line and they don't, nobody hands over money or anything like that. But that's really what they care about. So if I go and I see, let me give you an example. I go and see Julia Gillard before the 2007 election campaign, and I take her through, and she's the Shadow Minister for Employment, and I take her through one of my ideas, which I think is a fantastic idea. I took the idea of national information policy to the 2020 summit, which was a big all singing, all dancing summit for new ideas that Kevin Rudd held. And this thing ended up being called Windows on Workplaces. And it goes like this. If we believe in, if we look at the labour market, one of the things that jumps out at me from the labour market, you never really hear it talked about much, but if you look at the labour market, one of the things that jumps out is that most people go into jobs and they don't know whether they're going to enjoy them.
Yeah.
They don't know what their colleagues next to them think of those jobs. And they make a big leap in the dark, which is one quite good explanation for why labour market mobility is quite low. Now, then you observe that most companies of any size actually have a lot of data about that. Most companies of any size spend quite a lot of their time asking their employees what they think, whether they're engaged, how much they align themselves with what the company's doing, how excited they are to do work, and how well managed they are, and all this sort of stuff. So as part of a thought experiment, the first question is, well, gee, it'd be nice if we got all that data out there. So, Charles, if I ask you why that data isn't released, given that people would be interested in it, I think you'd be able to give me a fairly quick answer. So I'll let you give me that answer.
So when you say
data on, say, in KPMG or Deloitte or Ford, on the percentage of people who say they're well managed, the percentage of people who say there's a good career structure, the percentage of people who say there's good flexibility in hours, the percentage of people who say, I believe in what Ford Motor Company is doing.
Yeah.
So there's lots of data on that stuff because Ford Motor Company is collecting it all.
Yeah.
So why doesn't it release it?
Well, usually the data probably isn't that good for them, and if anybody's looking in the market, they're going to go. Yeah,
they might be embarrassed.
Yeah,
but that's not a very good answer because that doesn't answer the question of why don't the best firms publish that data, because that would be good for them. And I think, yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, sorry. I was just thinking about sometimes, with like when you have to refer a past employee, you can't give them a negative appraisal. Is there like legals behind it as well?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, that's quite possible.
yeah,
But anyway, my point is that it actually is a bit of a paradox. Not that most firms don't release it, but why the best firms don't release it. And I think the answer is fairly clear, which is that if you did release it, no one would really know what it meant because nobody knows how to compare it with
yeah.
anything
No
else.
comparable. Yeah,
That's right. So if you think that, and if you think this data could actually be very valuable, because it would be certainly valuable in terms of human welfare, but we also know that workers who feel themselves well managed and aligned with what the company's doing are more productive and so on. So I think it could be a really quite substantial economic. It could have quite substantial dollars and cents economic benefit as well as quite substantial non-dollars and cents well-being impacts. So my way, and it wouldn't cost anything, and if it didn't work, then it wouldn't really be any skin off anyone's nose. So my policy, the way I would deal with this is I would, as a government, I would whoever the prime minister, we'll have a hypothetical prime minister called Malcolm Turnbull, and I would say which businesses in Australia want to take Malcolm Turnbull's challenge or Julia Gillard's challenge to be good employers. And what that would involve is getting together with other businesses who've identified themselves to all agree on a partial standard against which they can say the first 10 questions they ask their employees are all the same, and then they can report against that standard. And you can also send out the Australian Bureau of Statistics to compulsorily survey, say, 3,000 businesses to calibrate the landscape, to tell you if you get a particular result with one question where you are in, whether you're in the top 20% of companies or the bottom 40% of companies or whatever.
yeah.
And then I think you would get quite voluntarily, you would start to get quite a bit of data out. And when the best firms are reporting, that starts reflecting on the firms that are not doing this. And so that would draw more in. How far you would get, I don't know, but it has virtually zero costs and potentially large benefits. So I took this to Julia Gillard before the 2007 election, and she just sort of stared blankly at me and thought this was, extremely eccentric, really. I mean, very kind of weird. And she sort of said, well, I'll ask an industry association what they think of it, which is a perfectly reasonable response. I mean, she's a busy person. You're not expecting her to be, she's got a lot of things on her mind, and she doesn't need a kind of crazy dreamer like me to come in with a bright idea. And so her way of filtering these things is to say, well, I'll ask an industry association. Of course, the industry association was not interested either. And I mean, I didn't even go and see the industry association, but that idea is still out there. And so this is apropos of your question, are politicians good or bad? Julia Gillard, I think, is a pretty decent person, but she's going to be driven by the necessary and relentless self-interestedness of politics, if you know what I mean. What comes up on her radar is when people are going to make her life miserable if she doesn't listen carefully to what they say and come up with a response. And the fact that, and now I'm making an audacious claim, the fact that I had a good idea does not rate in that world. It just doesn't rate until you have a group of people who start saying, I'm going to make life miserable for politicians who don't take this idea seriously. So that's how politics works.
It sounds like, I don't know, almost like I know, like people would be like, oh, you're going to cost the taxpayer more money, but it almost sounds like there needs to be a government body which can listen to this information, do like a cost benefit analysis on it, and then put it up. But it just like you got to wrangle through people, and
then we have one of those in Australia. It's called the Productivity Commission, and it's I think it does some good work. It does some bad work, but it's part of a kind of a careerist structure.
Yeah.
And it sort of second guesses politics a bit sometimes as well. But we do have those organisations, and I guess I feel much more strongly. I memean, as I say, I'm not. I like the idea of the Productivity Commission. My father is one of the things my father set up. He helped to set up the predecessor of the Productivity Commission, which is called the Industries Assistance Commission. But my great frustration is that, in my way of looking at the world, that body would be really showing some imagination about thinking about the form that reform takes. There are so many really tremendously important questions. I can go through some of them, but instead, it's saying, can't we contract out more human services? You know what I mean? It's to get back to the earlier thing. It's not tackling these questions with the imagination and the curiosity that I wish it was. But we do have such an organisation, and I would have thought universities have that role. But again, what they're doing is they're all marching to their KPIs, which are getting articles published in learned journals. And not one of the ideas I've talked to you about tonight, could you get into a learned journal in economics?
Yeah.
For the benefit of the idea. If you did enough mathematical jujitsu on it, you could put it there. But if we wanted to write about the Toyota production system and its potential, well, it would all have to be, you'd have to build some silly model that you know what you'd have to do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a sad state really for innovation. Now,
yeah,
innovation's one side of that's the good, like you could say it's like the playful, happy side of what government can do, but maybe this is like the important side, the safety net side. How do you ensure that policy is incorruptible and really secures the safety of the public?
Well, we have some pretty good mechanisms. We have judicial independence. One idea that is being pushed by some friends of mine who've recently published a book, quite a striking book. It's called Game of Mates, and it's about all the ways in which rents are driving a lot of corruption and a lot of theft, if I can use a provocative word. So take the case of where a land developer is able to have land rezoned. That can be overnight produce a massive windfall for that developer interest. And that's going to attract a lot of money, and it's a natural place where corruption can grow. And we have done nothing about that. In fact, I remember a quite right-wing fellow, a guy who used to work for the Centre for Independent Studies, a guy called Peter Saunders, who's now gone back to the United Kingdom. He was enamoured of capitalism, as well he might be. There's a lot to like about capitalism, but he was really there was something about capitalism that sort of aided him, which was that it reward the people who get really rich in capitalism. Only a small minority of them are people who made some incredible contribution, like Zuckerberg, or you could say Gates. But Gates, both of those guys have done bad things as part of making a lot of money, as well as good things as part of making a lot of money. But then compare that with, according to the calculations of these guys, I hope I'm not misquoting them, but according to these guys, 80% of the wealthiest Australians have earned their money in these very rent-heavy sectors like property development, finance, and so on.
Yeah.
And so that is another big magnet, another big fertilizer for corruption, and where we seem to be rather bad at that. I don't think we're a corrupt country. We're one of the least corrupt countries in terms of our governments, certainly our federal government. I don't think there's too many bribes taken, but it's getting worse. in terms of naked bribe taking, I don't want to argue it's getting worse. It's probably getting better, but the self-interestedness of politics, I think, is getting worse. The extent to which whole sectors like finance and like property development rely on artificial rents that are generated by policy, I think that might be worse than ever. Certainly in finance, healthcare, and some other areas, probably law. It's very bad. If in some areas, maybe getting worse.
Yeah.
And it would be nice if we could address those things. The other thing I would say is I'm putting another plug for citizens' juries, because one of the rules that we use in politics is to end people's careers very rigidly. I remember a good friend of mine becoming Auditor General of New South Wales, and he had a 7-year term, and that was it. He couldn't be renewed. He couldn't be anything. And so that concentrates your mind, and you may as well do the best job you can. And if you're getting the Premier offside, this was a state Auditor General, there was nothing the Premier could do about you unless you were committing a crime. And towards the end of the term, you had no incentive to do him any favours anyway, because you were going to be out of a job at the end of your term anyway. Now, that is the case with citizens' juries. Citizens' juries are appointed, and they may, one of the things we haven't experimented, we've done a lot of experimentation with temporary citizens' juries around the world, but we haven't persevered with standing citizens' juries. But even if you have standing citizens' juries, the idea is that people rotate through them. And so every individual has no real incentive to do anything other than do the right thing, unless they're taking bribes, of course.
Yeah.
Because there's no favour anyone can do them in terms of what happens to them at the end of their term.
I haven't released this show yet, but I had a great interview with Cameron Murray, and we did actually go into a lot of detail about the corruption.
That's right. Yes.
But yeah, soon to be released. Anyway, to add on to that as well, I know we have like regulating bodies. We got tons of regulating bodies, but how do we know they're doing a good job? How do we watch the watchers?
Well, I don't know the answer. We have, as I say, I think it's sort of the same answer I gave you before. We have a structure. It's pretty good by comparison with societies that came before us and other societies around the world. I like the idea of more citizen advocates. That's, I suppose, I mean, as far as regulators are concerned, I mean, I think the way in which regulators, it troubles me that regulators that government employees generally have such a high level of security. Now, I know that, the reason they got that security was just in the normal way, which is through social struggle, just acquiring power. But the rationale for it, the sort of idea, the justification of it is that if you give people security, they can act without fear or favour. I fear that this is careerism is a terrible problem for our society. Careerism is the environment in which good people can do pretty bad things. It's careerism that would lead the executives of James Hardie to continue to cover up their own knowledge that they were killing their own workers. I mean, it's very important for us to continually remind ourselves that these were just ordinary people. These were, hundreds of people, or perhaps the executives, it wasn't hundreds of people, but there were no people who said this mustn't stand, this must not happen. We can't, all of us knowing that we are giving innocent people cancer, but everyone did it. And that's normal. That's the way the world is. So that's something to just keep in mind all the time, and to try to keep alive those parts of our makeup and our institutions that encourage people to not accept that. Now, we've done something along those lines with whistleblower legislation. It's been pretty half-hearted. And if you want to be a whistleblower, your life will still be made a misery. But we have tried to do something about that. But, I'm a bit of a believer in eternal vigilance, and also not asking the question of yourself. Do you really know that you would have been one of those people who said, I'm not going to put up with this. Not only am I going to resign, I'm going straight to the press, and I'm not only am I not going to be part of killing people as a bit of collateral for making a bit of collateral damage to what most people do every day, which is try and earn their living, but I'm going to stop it.
Yeah.
It's amazing how rare such people are, and how easy it is to normalize things that are monstrous.
Yeah, it's a real sorry state of affairs, really. Like, because it's yeah, like everyone just got like, I just want to go to work. I just want to earn my keep, put dinner on the table. Why do I need to get myself embroiled with all this big? Like,
and I think a lot of the time that's right. A lot of the time, people just should mind their own business, and only when they, but then sometimes it really matters, and then you're being tested. Then then it's not funny. You either you judged by what you do, and people don't find it at all easy to work out where that line is. I don't find it that easy to know where that line is. I've been tempted on occasion to be a whistleblower, and not about anything like that, but just about sloppy behaviour.
Yeah.
And, I could tell you some stories about really incompetent behaviour in places that I've worked, and you could mount an argument that I really should have outed people for it.
Yeah.
But I haven't, and I don't think that was the wrong thing to do, personally or ethically, really.
Yeah. When you when you consider a policy, how many people should be considered? Because obviously you can't quite satisfy everybody, but obviously there's the majority that have voted in, and they want these kind of things in place. And then there's the rest, the outsiders. Do you try and find something to suit all, or do you know that you're going to have to crack some eggs?
Well, yes, there's this fantasy called Pareto optimality, in which nobody ends up being worse off, and no one's ever, that's a bit like that, and unicorns have never been observed in nature. So yes, even generally speaking, my sympathies are with people who don't have much money and don't have much power, and we have to be as solicitous as we can of their interests. But I'm not a believer in saying that, that our society is paralyzed by the possibility of somebody getting on the TV who can tell a sob story, and this is what passes for compassion in our society. And it's pretty clear that you have to try and do the best you can for people, but at a policy level, that's going to be about groups. And obviously, if there's some egregious affront to somebody's individual rights, well, we do have systems to try and address that, and we should keep them strong, strengthen them possibly. But a policy for everyone to have a decent retirement income, a policy to have an efficient tax system will sometime, it will not be a case that everyone's a winner, and it will not be the case that absolutely everyone in a bracket that in a group of people that you really want to help, there will be some people, for some reasons, perverse or otherwise, that are disadvantaged by that. And, that's that you just have to accept that, I guess.
Go with it. So we're going to now go into economics more than anything else now, and your analysis. So what's going on with Australia in terms of its middle class? And I think like the biggest problem, everyone talks about it, is pretty much in like the first thing that you see in the columns and in the newspaper, the property
That's
market.
gonna dispose me badly to it. If everyone's saying it, I always assume that it's wrong, but I think I'm going to agree. So the property market, the property market's a terrible thing. It's in a terrible state. It's in a socially dysfunctional state because it's priced people out of the market. So that's very bad. It's led to a very dangerous amount of private debt. So yep, I think all that's very bad.
Do you think that like that there should be kind of like these policies that you get in, say if you was in Thailand or Mexico, that only the nationals should be able to buy a property? So like say if you and I went over there, they'll say, look, sorry, you can't buy a house. You either got to marry a local or it's not going to happen. Do you think there's something akin to owning property and being part of a citizen, that it's like some kind of like social good that should be returned to you, and it shouldn't be this like great big speculative bubble thing that everyone's that's going like that.
I don't know enough. I haven't thought about it enough to have a strong view. I suppose until a year or so ago, as recently as that, I would have had a presumption in favour of a pretty free arrangement. I think we've now seen the way in which financial deregulation has generated the financialization of our world in a way that I think is pretty clear has more costs than benefits. It has some benefits, there's no doubt about that. And so I'm now much more curious about what. I'm not. So to summarise where I'm at, I think that financialisation has been pretty disastrous. It's been more disastrous where it's been most intense, which is in the United States, but it's been pretty disastrous here. There have been some good things about it, some very good things about it to do with funding innovation and so on, although not typically at scale. It's been mostly sort of new startups and things. But anyway, there are a whole range of benefits that have come from financial deregulation, and we should, if I was again, we're back to me as a philosopher king. I don't think any of this is very realistic, but if I was sort of trying to, if I was like God is on the Sistine ceiling, and I was setting things up, so I'd want to retain, and I think it would be relatively easy to retain quite a lot of what the gains we've got, and that would be partly by privileging equity over debt. But the way in which debt has, you then end up with a sort of an auction for financial assets, the way in which finance ceases to fund new economic activity but goes into purchasing collateral at escalating prices, the way in which the entire finance sector is a war of insiders between themselves, but all against outsiders. These are really terrible afflictions that we now suffer from, which are now political afflictions.
Yeah.
So that's just my thinking. I'm a long way from thinking I know what to do other than those hints. The other thing is I've done quite a lot of thinking about reforming banking and central banking, and I think I've got a fantastic idea there, and I published it. I published it several years ago in the United Kingdom. The Bank of England was quite interested in it, or I came and gave a presentation there, and they wanted me to do that. No interest has been shown about it here, but I published this in a daily or in a newspaper about a month ago, and that basically argues that banking is not a typical sector. We have a private sector with where firms compete and governments regulate. The government's part of the market. The government is at the apex of the market. It controls the central bank, and I argued that just as Amazon sells competes with book retailers, just as Qantas competes with travel agents over the internet, that the central bank should be free to compete with banks rather than, and to do that by offering Australian citizens or people in Australia the very thing that they provide to banks, which is an exchange settlement account. That is an account on which people can park money, receive the cash rate as interest, and exchange money so they can pay each other. And on the presentation of satisfactory collateral, also borrow money. So that's what I would do with banking. That would mean that the central bank would become a much larger institution, or rather, it wouldn't become that much bigger in terms of the number of people in it, but it would have much more assets. It might take on, say, half of the assets that are currently the assets of the private commercial banks. That would make banking much stabler, much safer for people to use, much, much cheaper, and it might even absolve you from some of the really hard questions about how you regulate what remains of banking and whether you, solve bank runs with indefinite loans and all of those kinds of things. So
Yeah.
I do have one worked out model, one horse in that race that I've done quite a lot of thinking about. But more generally about finance, I think it's a big problem. And because the solutions are regulatory, they're just very countercultural. Today's policy elite just doesn't really know what to make of that.
Yeah. Going back to the middle class of Australia now, this is the land of the fair go, and if there's like this kind of a promise that happens with society that if you work hard, you earn some money, you buy yourself a house, you can have the wife and the kids, you can have a relatively happy life, or the husband and kids,
Yep.
and just you can just meet that standard, and life is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how much a house is going for in Stratfield now? It's going up for like 5 million now. I've recently seen. It's ridiculous money. It's just people's lives are just gone. Oh, I can't do this. I'm gonna have to put my life on hold. I can't have kids. I can't have a relationship. I can't have any of this kind of stuff. What kind of social upheaval is going to occur from this? And we're only seeing the start of this right now. And I think I'll go into like what. And this is another question I would say as well to you. If we were going to put you in charge of the Australian economy, what kind of reforms would you put in place to change these kind of problems?
Well, I think that we can do quite a bit. If I'm philosopher king, I think you can do quite a lot with financial regulation. That you have to also realise that there's some unfairness. There's always going to be some unfairness in financial regulation. One thing it does is that it enables the rich to buy cheaply. Because you are suppressing the financial options of people without a lot of money, the wealthy can pick up financial assets more cheaply. So that there are dilemmas in all of this. That's one thing I would do. I think that it's also absolutely the case that the main problem is a supply problem. We need to have more supply. We have to regulate local housing in such a way that there can be made more supply. I find height restrictions an incredibly crude way to regulate a city. I accept that huge sort of windy canyons with skyscrapers everywhere can be very unpleasant.
Yeah.
But I think we need to find ways of regulating the use of land, which doesn't imagine that you've been an aesthetic genius by saying you can't build over 6 stories or 7 stories. I mean, if I look around London, it sort of amazes me that there aren't lots of skyscrapers, and you might want them well out of the city, because the city has a certain heritage value, and you might think. I mean, the thing about London is that everywhere's got heritage value, but you make some trade-offs and you identify some places. So if you look at London, but I mean this applies elsewhere, there are certainly cities that have. I mean, it's certainly easy to make a city ugly and unpleasant to live in if you simply let it become a canyon of skyscrapers. But I mean, I live in Port Melbourne. There are some ugly high-rise buildings built on the beach. That was the wrong place for them. They should have been built a couple of 100 meters back from the beach, where most of the views would still have stretched to the beach. And then you can let people go up 100 stories if they want. And you can provide them with lots of parkland and so on. So there are ways of densifying cities that are, that are much more effective than what we're doing. The other thing that is amazing, and I haven't talked about this at all, you might be surprised to hear an economist talk about it, but I think there is an architect and philosopher of sorts called I think his name's Christopher Alexander, and he poses a question along these lines. This may not be precisely the question, but a question along these lines. How is it that in the West, or, well, let's just say it's in the West, virtually no major public building built before 1970 isn't beautiful? To put it would not to remove the double negative. Almost every big major public building built before 1940 is a beautiful building, and almost every building built after 1960 is ugly, utilitarian in a crude, almost offensive way.
Yeah.
This is an extraordinary phenomenon. This is an extraordinary phenomenon in our culture. I can go down to the city. I can sit in the Legislative Council. It's a room that no one remarks on. That's fine, because there are probably plenty of these rooms. It's an absolutely sublime room. It may not be the product of architectural genius. I mean, in fact, it is, but not of any individual who designed it in the 19th century, but because architecture was an integral craft. It celebrated the skills of the mason and all of the tradespeople who built the room. It paid attention to patterns that were thousands of years old, columns that we got from the Greeks and so on, to the proportions in the room, the effect of colours on our mood. Well, they don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
They do it very, very rarely. So I'd like to see us have a decent crack at trying to build public goods that were beautiful, where regulation focused on utility and beauty and amenity, and not on something as appallingly crude as saying every building in an entire neighborhood can't be above 2 or 3 stories high. I just think that's awful. Just awful. Without rejecting the basic human values that say that human beings are not to be plonked into the landscape willy-nilly, which is roughly how we do it, subject to height limits now, that we want to express our best selves in our built environment, and that can be skyscrapers of 100 stories high, big parks, dense population density, great public transport, some good private transport options. We're not doing all that well in these regards.
So, would this be your sort of vision then? If we put you in charge to run the economy,
Well, you've had a few visions from me right now. I've given you quite a few, but yes, if you want me in charge of a city, that's what I'm going to do to a city. So I'm going to say 100 stories is fine with me, 200's even better, but you can't have canyons with windswept canyons. This has got to be an expression of your love for our great species.
Yeah. So that's like more on an urban level, but on an actual national level, how would you target policy to actually reform things to make society better?
Well, I've just sort of been through a bunch of areas. The main rule is you come to see me. I'm the philosopher king, and I'll tell you whether it's any good or not, won't I? But I mean, I've sort of tried to sketch out the basic ideas. I'm a Democrat. I think of myself as more of a Democrat than most because I think that we need to bolster democracy with democracy by lot. We need to think about our economy in a constructive sort of way. We want to protect prosperity. We also want to understand that schools are not factories, hospitals are, not making cars, they're repairing people. There are lots of things to be done to get on the front foot on things like health and education. Yeah. This, this is everyone saying these kinds of things, of course, and I haven't, I can't pull out of my hat some brilliant bit of policy in each of these areas, but in some of the areas, I think I've given you some examples of things that nobody's talked about, and yet then there's nothing that they're concocted out of extremely simple materials, simple ideas. With the example I just gave you of central banking for all, that's concocted out of the simple little trick of competitive neutrality. You just say, well, if the central bank's doing this for a bank, why can't it, and the internet's around, why can't it do it for us all? Yeah. Likewise, Windows on workplaces, a way possibly of building, for the first time, a kind of market in workplace well-being, where employees and prospective employees can look around the workforce and go, the workforce over there, that's getting the kind of metrics that makes it the kind of workforce I'd like to work in. Huge welfare gains can come from that. Gains from trade. People can head towards a company that's run the way they'd like a company to be run, and other people at different stages of their lives or with different temperaments can head back to the company these people fled from.
Yeah.
Into Darwinian Central, and they say, I'm going to make more money there, I'll have a waterfront house, and I can take it. I don't mind if it's super competitive and pretty toxic. So that's a simple, absolutely straight out of an economic textbook, and yet nobody's talking about that. So that's what I'd do. I'd be running the place pretty much the way it's run now, and then whenever someone comes up with an idea made of simple ingredients that look like they might do something powerful and good, try it out in a way that isn't too costly, and if it starts to work, spread it.
Well, thank you very much for that, Nick.
Right.
Just on a side note,
Yep.
we're travelling on the long side now. It's like a bit it's coming on to 11:30.
2 hours and 37 minutes on my Skype connection.
Yeah, so
and I'm coming hoarse, as you probably noticed.
Yeah. So I think what I'll do is I'll put a close to our conversation now, but we've still got pretty much we're only halfway there.
Good.
Would you mind coming back for another session?
Let's do it. But why don't you put that one out and then we'll do another session after that?
Yep, that'll be perfect. Okay.
All right. That sounds good.
Thank you very much for your time, Nick.
Thanks, Charles.
Just from your side, where can people find you? What's the websites? What's the links? Or if they want to get in contact with you?
So you can find me, you can email me if you want to at ngruen, that is N for Nicholas, GRUEN, 6 letters, @gmail.com is the simplest way to get to me. You can also use the handle of my website, which is lateraleconomics.com.au, which is a economic policy consultancy. Wherever you are, we can do work for you if you'd like me to. I also blog fairly. I've been blogging since about 2005 on a joint blog in Australia called Club Troppo. That's Club Troppo, TROPPO.com.au. And I've written in the last couple of years a lot of my more serious essays on that. You'll find them on Troppo, but they're first published on a website which is targeted at government called The Mandarin. I think the URL is themandarin.com.au. And if you'd be able to find my name and have a look at some of my more substantial essays, and certainly quite a few of the ideas I've talked about in this discussion can be found written up in a fairly in a fairly considered way there. I'm also have a number of I'm on the advisory board of, and have a number of articles on evonomics.com. So those are some places you can find.
You're well spread around.
I am well spread around.
All right. Well, very good to talk to you, Nick. I'll be in touch.
Okay, and for the last 20 minutes, quietly, while I haven't been answering questions or listening to your questions, I've been looking for that quote from that book about love in the time of the bombs, but I haven't been able to find it. But I might be able to email it to you at some stage.
Oh yeah, no worries.
Right.
Yeah. We'll when we do our catch up again, we can set the record straight on those facts.
Indeed. Okay.
All right.
Thanks very much.
Good to talk to you. Thanks for your time.
Okay. See you. Bye.
Bye.